Perfect. I would like now to welcome Alberto Briones from Lifecycle Dynamics to talk about the wizardry of European market access archetypes.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me? Perfect. So yeah, good morning, everyone, and it's great to be here, but also to be presenting just the second talk of the whole conference. And as Anna mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the wizardry. I also had to practice a few times of market access archetypes. And I think it's great to see that now we have 1,000 people in the conference. And as Anna said, this highlights the importance of market access. And this is because although we have more medicines, of course, we need to work harder to get all those medicines to patients, there are still huge challenges in terms of access. And just to focus in terms of the market in Europe, when you see the time that it takes for those medicines to actually reach patients, you see a huge disparity across Europe. And you have countries like Germany, where we will say that it's a relatively good time frame, with about 133 days for medicines that get approved to reach patients. I don't know whether actually that's a good time frame or is still taking too long. But then when you go to the other side of the spectrum, you have countries like Romania, where it takes almost 3 years for medicines to get to patients. So in my perspective, that's just unacceptable. But then it's not just about the time that it takes. It's about how many of those medicines that get approved actually reach the patients in the end. And when you see here in this bottom figure, in Germany, around 92% of the medicines that get approved centrally by EMA reach patients in Germany. But then when you go to Spain, only 53% of those reach patients. And then when you go to Lithuania, only 16% of those medicines reach patients. So you can see here a huge gap in terms of all the medicines that actually get approved versus the ones that actually made it in the end to the patients. So we certainly have a big issue in front of us. Of course, this is driven by many, many different factors. But we know that one of them is the fact that navigating the European market access is very, very complex, because we have to navigate through a lot of dynamics across different countries. To give you an example, 2 years ago, the industry had to adapt to Brexit. So what do we need to do? Fine, now we need to see what the UK wants to do, and now they are going to have to review the medicines independently through the MHRA. But then last week, we heard again that now the UK is going to adopt decisions from regulatory bodies in other countries like the US. So again, back to the drawing board to update our framework of how the UK works. But when you have to do this across every single country in Europe, it gets overwhelming. So no wonder why it is challenging for pharmaceutical companies or biotech companies to be able to do this for every single country in Europe. So how can we navigate the European market? Whether you are planning to launch a new product, or maybe you are just restructuring your strategy because there's a new competitor, or maybe there are changes in regulations, pretty much the approach is integrating a bunch of different insights, a bunch of different factors and elements to drive your strategy. So you go through this exercise of assessing the opportunity of your product, assessing the TPP, understanding the stakeholders, and then understanding, what's the best approach in terms of contracting. So it's very a labor-intensive exercise. And we know that this exercise goes through a series of different processes, which is, first, you have to align internally with your stakeholders, right? So you have to integrate everything that the commercial team needs versus what the medical team needs versus what the market access team needs. And then you have to go through different types of research with payers, with key opinion leaders, with HCPs to get their feedback. And then you have to, again, feed it back to your teams, and so on. So it's a very iterative and complex process. But when you have to repeat these 27 times, you can see again that huge challenge that we have in front of us. So no wonder why there is still this gap in access across Europe. So how could we streamline this process a little bit more? And if my slides want to move, I'll tell you. Or maybe I need to point somewhere else. There you go. So archetyping is one of those tools. And archetyping is not a new concept. Of course, we are familiar with the concept of archetypes. Overall, the principle is relatively simple, right? So archetyping market dynamics allows us to efficiently test hypotheses, define strategies, and facilitate decision-making across multiple stakeholders or across multiple affiliates. Basically, the idea is that archetyping allows us to make sense of chaos, right? Maybe we start kind of identifying trends that we can leverage to increase the efficiency of these processes. Now, of course, in principle, it sounds great, but then how do we actually do it? And one of the challenges is that we tend to think of archetypes as an oversimplification of the process, right? But actually, we need to understand that we cannot oversimplify things, because, of course, we just talk about very complex dynamics. So instead, we need to let the dynamics of the therapy area or the market that we are planning entering to drive that exercise. So I'm going to use just biosimilars today as a case study or as an example to illustrate how we allow those dynamics, in this case of biosimilars, to drive the exercise of archetyping. So the first question is, what elements drive biosimilar use or biosimilar uptake? So we start by dissecting pretty much the dynamics of biosimilars. So we know that one of the key aspects is how does it work at the country level, the tendering and contracting? Is it national, regional, at the hospital level? And then once you get to those tendering processes, do you have always a single winner, or you have multiple winners in those tendering exercises? Then what elements drive whether you win or not a tender? Is it mainly price-driven, or maybe there are some value elements that can be leveraged? Are there mandatory discounts that manufacturers have to offer? And also biosimilar prescription quotas. 10, 12 years ago, when we have some of the first few biosimilars, all of these concepts, of course, didn't exist. And the industry had to adapt to biosimilars. But nowadays, we're talking about more pressure to use biosimilars in order to save some money, to reduce the impact on budgets. So you have prescription quotas. You have now, in some countries, some kind of pharmacy-level substitution. And this is there is a lot of debate around this topic. But again, it's another dynamic that now we have to introduce into this conversation. So we have all these different elements. Now, how do we actually use these elements to understand market dynamics for biosimilars? We have to map all these elements across the different countries. And we have to understand how all these different elements interact in each country. Now, I was going to make you read this slide, but I understand that it's a bit busy, so instead we just color-code it. And then immediately you can start seeing some patterns. Now, I want to be just very careful to say that it's very clear, because it's not, actually. And that's exactly what we're trying to understand about archetypes, is that initially we perceive archetypes as an oversimplification, but actually it's not that easy. Because as much as we try to look for those clear patterns, it's not black and white. But at least it helps you to already identify some kind of trends, some kind of commonalities across different countries, and some key elements that maybe are very significant across different countries. So once we understand these different elements across countries, we can then put them in a framework so that we can actually start identifying those trends and archetypes. At this point, we just have a bunch of countries across, in a plot. And if you look at the axis, we, again, try to identify those main elements from the previous table in terms of the decision-making. Is it purely driven by the payers, or is it purely driven by HCPs, and everything in between? And if you look at the other axis, then you have, what's the competition and pricing pressure on either the originator or the biosimilars? Is there high pressure because biosimilars are a must when you go to that country? And based on these, you can start now identifying the archetypes to build your strategies. So if we were analyzing this from the originator perspective, where you need to protect your product because there is now biosimilar competition, and for this example, think of just one biosimilar, the first biosimilar entering the market, you can already identify some of these archetypes that then you can use to develop your strategies. So where you have mainly HCP-led decision-making with no price pressure, this is the biggest opportunity for an originator because you can strengthen your messaging and make sure that by engaging HCPs, your product is going to remain healthy in that market. Where in the other extreme, you have countries where maybe really it's all about the price. Therefore, you will need to think about how you strategize and prioritize different accounts, and then you will have to play with the price to maybe provide some, kind of disciplined discounts. But similarly, if you were thinking from the biosimilar perspective, of course, the landscape is the opposite, right? And then you can already identify those opportunities for the product. So in complete opposite to the other example, in this case, the biggest opportunity for a biosimilar are those countries where it's all about the price. So therefore, the biosimilar manufacturers can just be very aggressive, with pricing, which is, not uncommon. But basically, these two examples are just a way of how you use actually that framework and those archetypes to derive some strategies. Again, I want to be conscious that this is a little bit simplified just for this talk, because of course there are multiple other aspects that we need to consider. The product itself, the therapy area dynamics of what's available for those patients in this area. But the idea is to actually just make the process more efficient, but maybe identifying those key strategies. Because with this exercise, what we are doing is, again, trying to make sense of this very complex set of different 28 markets with different dynamics, different payer structures, and then through this exercise of archetyping, we can already start identifying these strategies that are focused for those archetypes specifically. But one very important thing is, this also allows us to identify strategies that will apply across countries regardless of the archetype. And this is very important because what happens when we have to go through these different exercises in Europe is if you're delegating a lot of these tasks to the affiliates, sometimes you start losing, that main strategy. And it's natural, of course. When everything gets segmented, you start losing a little bit of the big picture. But in this way, you can actually maintain that main strategy across different countries. To give you an example of the biosimilars from the originator perspective, the originator will focus then on across countries, regardless of archetype, on making sure that they accelerate the development of a new formulation. But then they were able to actually identify strategies that are important for those archetypes, and then all that is left is to refine the country-specific strategies. So I hope so far it makes sense and it sounds good. Now, how do we actually do it, right? So again, it's a process and it's iterative, but it's a little bit simpler than having to do the exercise in each country. So we start by developing preliminary archetypes. And then we need to, of course, test and validate those archetypes to make sure that actually we are in the right way. And you know that all of these exercises are typically done with internal workshops, then some payer engagement, and then back to the internal workshops. But then after that exercise, we will be able to identify what, again, I mentioned before, those archetype-specific strategies that we can then go, refine, and then bring back to the payers and say, OK, these are my final strategies. Do you agree with them? And then you can deploy them. Now, one element that is critical for the whole exercise is actually validating the archetypes. Because if you go through the whole process and actually we were, a little bit wrong in our initial hypotheses, then of course the final product is going to be wrong. So just to give you an example of how you go through this exercise, we conducted some very quick payer research just to exemplify for this talk. So we connected with some payers from the UK, Spain, and France through one of our virtual platform tools, just to ask them if they agreed with our concept of archetyping, if they agree with our archetypes that we had derived for biosimilars, but also what elements and criteria they thought would be important for archetypes beyond biosimilars. So we went through the exercise as we did for biosimilars, dissecting the dynamics that drive the use of a new product, in this case in oncology. And then we asked the payers if they agree with these elements, and then which of these elements they consider the most important. Now, one caveat is this is not exhaustive research, of course, and the sample is very small, but it's just to give you an idea that when you start looking at what payers across different countries think about these different elements, you already see some patterns in terms of in which countries the current treatment options are more important versus maybe the HTA process. Again, this is not exhaustive, but it just shows you an initial take on what those payers might think. And similarly, we did the exercise for rare diseases, and you can see kind of some differences here and some commonalities in other countries. So again, the main message here is that you need to let these therapy area dynamics drive the exercise so that you can then draw the archetypes that you need to build your strategies. And finally, we asked them, based on these analysis that we did for the biosimilars, do you agree with the archetypes for your country? And we were very happy because they all agree that the archetypes that we had derived for each of those countries were relatively close to what they believe to be, which again, it goes to the point that it's critical to validate archetypes. So just to summarize, the idea of archetypes is not really to simplify things, but rather just to find a way to make the process more efficient by letting the dynamics of a therapy area drive the analysis, and to really just make navigating the complex EU more efficiently. Because again, this exercise just allows us to more efficiently pressure test hypotheses and scenarios, but also allows us to validate our strategies, and more importantly, to kind of make the decision-making internally among different stakeholders a little bit easier. So I just want to conclude by thanking the team. You can see here that many of us are here at WEPA today, so please come and see us in booth 14. But yeah, thanks very much, everyone, if you have any questions.
Thank you, Alberto. I think we have time for a couple of questions. I think while we find the mic for something on the back, there is some questions. One from me, Alberto. So I think when it comes to validating, those market archetypes, I think most of us have access to networks in the key markets, I think in your validation exercise. How do we go about the smaller markets? I think that sometimes is a bit of a challenge as much as we want to archetype. So any advice on how to ensure that we are not missing the nuances for those Romanias and Slovenias that you had in your slide?
That's a good point, and actually that's the main purpose of the archetypes, because many times those countries are deprioritized, just to put it simply, because it's challenging to have to conduct the payer research, and the idea of the archetypes is that you can do the pressure testing of your hypotheses, of your strategies, so that you can easily bring them to these countries. And the idea of the archetypes and validation is that instead of having to conduct this exhaustive payer research, where you have to do 20 payers in Lithuania, if you get a selected sample of payers from different countries of these archetypes, including 1 or 2 from Lithuania, at least you get that initial validation. And then the next step, which is then maybe refine the strategies, it's much easier. So I think the idea of the whole archetyping exercise is to actually make sure that we are not missing those countries. It is challenging, but at least it's going to make it a little bit easier.
Thank you, Alberto. Any other questions from the audience? I see something in the back. And apologies, because I think we're running 5 minutes late, but that's what you get with a Spanish chair. But hopefully we can catch up, yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Presentation. I just wanted to ask, do you see a role also for external reference pricing in this archetyping? And for instance, when you were giving us the example of biosimilars, you mentioned in some countries where HTA is more demanding, you might have to apply some discounts, but that can impact other countries through ERP. So how do you see that? Do you also consider that in these archetypes?
Yeah, so definitely in the case of the biosimilars, external pricing reference, but also mandatory discounts is key to what influences each country. I think but that actually comes in the later stage when you're refining the strategies. So initially, you need to consider whether it's purely price-driven versus maybe there is some room for the HCP to make the decision, and then the hybrid cases where you may have some kind of quotas to prescribe biosimilars, but it's not mandatory. And then when you come to refining is where you introduce the specific maybe pricing that you are considering. So I think it can be included from the beginning, but it's more important probably towards the refinement.
Perfect, thank you. And I think I'm getting a signal that we have to move on, but thank you, Alberto, so
Thanks, Rob.
much for a very interesting presentation.